All right, I just got the thumbs up. So let's get the Resiliency and Mitigation Council started. So my name is Barbara Richardson, and I'm the head of the agency, or the Department of Insurance and Financial Institutions. And we actually sponsored this, and we've been having monthly meetings. And welcome all of our panelists. It's been great. We have a couple folks who are going to be joining us either virtually or they're going to have to pick up the recording. But for everybody in the audience, either virtually or in person, we have a very jam-packed agenda today. So I'm going to keep my remarks short because we've got some universities who have come a long way. Specialists from universities come a long way to speak to us. And we should also hear from the utilities. So let's get this started. Why don't we first take a roll call? Carrie, if you could do that.
Okay, Council, if you're present when your name is called. If you're an alternate, please state your name and the name of the council member that you're representing. Randy Chevalier. Laura Curtis.
Present.
Mine Devon. Devonis. Terry Edwards.
Here.
Jacob Emnett.
Here.
Michael Newman. Dick Rhodes. Tom Savage.
Right here.
Tom Torres.
Present.
Barbara Richardson.
All right, I'm going to get started with just some logistics, general meeting logistics. This meeting is being broadcast online and is being recorded. The recording and associated meeting materials will be posted on the council's webpage. Comments in the chat will not be recorded. For council members online, please use the hand raise feature to speak. Except for public comment periods, only council members online will be able to unmute themselves and turn on their camera. If public comments are taken, each speaker's time will be limited to 2 minutes to provide everyone who wishes to comment the opportunity to do so. And to comment, fill out a speaking slip or the Google form online. And the speaking slips, Fausto, where are they? They're on the back table. I'd appreciate it if you do fill those out prior to us moving to public comments, because that does take time when you have to go fill out the forms. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get started with presentations from the universities. Kat and Frank, if you want to go ahead and join us up here at the table. So today we're honored to have two folks from, one from NAU here in Arizona, and the other is from Cal Poly, who flew in from California. Kat and Frank, if you'll just, I know Kat, you're going to start, if you'll just introduce yourself and a little bit of background, and then we'll get started with your presentation. Thank
Sure.
you.
Hi, I'm Kat Edgley. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Forestry at NAU. I'm a wildfire social scientist, and I've spent the last decade working with communities looking at how they adapt to fire, what makes them different across the Western US.
And Frank, I'm going to go ahead and have you introduce yourself now too, and then we'll start with Kat's presentation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. My name is Frank Freebolt. I'm the director of the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I'm primarily a fire practitioner since '79, but came to the university to try to link up that experience with some of the academic tools and capabilities that we have at Cal Poly. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, Kat, let's have you kick us off.
Okay, so my presentation today is kind of a high-level review of research we've been doing at NAU for the last 5 or 6 years now. We've been visiting communities all over the state, trying to figure out what makes them tick when it comes to fire. So if it's okay to move to the next slide. I mentioned I'm a social scientist. I want to start off with a brief kind of primer on where we're at with the social science on fire in Arizona. we recently did a literature review where we looked at all the research that exists at the community level for Arizona and New Mexico. And we actually have 4 decades worth. The first stuff was really published back in 1981, 82 in Tucson. And across all of this research, even back then, we were seeing kind of 70 to 90% support in surveys, in interviews for fuels treatments in and around communities in Arizona. So a lot of the research, the policy right now is questioning how we can get up to the landscape scale when we talk about fire adaptation. It starts at the household scale, but all that social science says the community scale is the scale to act at. And when I say community, I'm not necessarily talking about geographic community. I'm talking about connections between people and place. So that might be a homeowners association. That might be 5 ranchers up a drainage who work together and think the same things about the landscape. That makes it really challenging for us when we're talking about fire adaptation, when the policy often talks about geographic definitions, but we need to recognize that social diversity. Next slide. So the other quick slide I wanted to share here was, okay, if we're working at the community level, social scientists agree that's the right scale, then we're also talking about fire adapted communities. And this term came about and started getting used a lot after the cohesive strategy was introduced a little over a decade, or about a decade ago now. We went through the literature on this also a few years ago, and we questioned, how do you actually define fire adapted community? It's showing up in the literature, it's showing up in the policy everywhere. What does that mean? It turns out almost no one is defining it, but we can see 2 kind of conceptualizations of what it means. So on the left-hand side, we have this idea of a policy-based fire adapted community, and that's when we say fire adapted community, we're talking about an objective, a goal, a target in documentation. It's an endpoint. A lot of times it's used as an umbrella term, so we might be saying Firewise community, a prescribed burn council, a CWPP. These are all kind of building blocks under the umbrella. But a lot of this implies that it's an end goal, but we don't necessarily know how to get there. And that's where the other definition comes in. It's process-based. So this is more about fire adaptation as a continual process. There is no end goal because we're always working on this challenge. It's related to the local context, people moving in and out, different fires, changing the ecosystem. So it's a lot more emergent. When we're talking about changing the fire culture, we're often talking about process-based. We need the policy-based to get there, but we shouldn't just stop at that checklist. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides, I want to kind of share some really high-level 5 big themes, takeaways from research that we've been doing at NAU. And this is just a little cherry picking of a few of those studies to give you an idea, but there's way more than what's on this map that I'll draw from today. Next slide. So the first theme I want to share from across all of these communities, and this is interview data with hundreds of community members. This is survey data with thousands of households across Arizona that I'll draw on. First one is we're talking a lot about mitigation programs as a motivator for communities. And there's a need to start evolving these programs a little bit. So Firewise is a big one. We have one of the highest densities of Firewise communities in the US in Prescott. What we were noticing when we visited with these communities is it's a great starting point, but after a few years, you kind of start to plateau. You've got the people involved who want to be involved. How do you evolve that program a little bit further without people losing interest? One of the challenges with Firewise is it's a checklist, essentially. You do these 5 steps, you become a community, then you're renewing it every year. And it was really interesting to see a lot of communities finding loopholes. One of the criteria is, X number of volunteer hours or X number of dollars on mitigation within the community. A lot of wealthier HOAs are spending that money on common areas and then using that to satisfy the requirements of Firewise, which then means we're not seeing as much on private property. So as we move forward, I think this is a great time to be asking questions about how do we evolve these mitigation programs if we're trying to create new ones or think about insurance in these contexts. First big one is these programs aren't going to work for every single community. Firewise is going to work really well in HOAs with older populations. You're not going to see ranchers super interested in picking this up. So if we do need to go a programmatic direction, what would that look like for a ranching community or a log cabin community versus a well-developed HOA? Within that, we need to build financial responsibility in these communities. So how are they going to keep investing beyond those common areas, beyond kind of textbook approaches? And then can we start building menus for different communities of what combinations of mitigation activities might look like? If you don't want to remove this tree, what is the other action that balances that out? How do we kind of differentiate different, kind of choose your own adventure for different places? Next slide. Second theme I want to mention is a growing over-reliance on subsidized mitigation. We have some fantastic grant programs, cost shares, volunteer opportunities to get work done on private property, fantastic catalysts for starting communities off, especially when they're excited early on. But we often see that communities who have more access to that maybe already have a lot of financial capacity to do this work without grants. So then we start to see differences in adaptation in communities over time as folks who have the skill sets to write grants are more successful, get more grants. So I think this is also an opportunity to kind of open the door to how can we diversify funding mechanisms and start to build financial responsibility a little bit more in some places where it is achievable. A few different ideas around that we're seeing in Arizona. Oh, sorry. So the first one would be if you're asking communities to apply for these kinds of funds, ask them to share their maintenance plan. If you're doing fuels work on their property, how are they going to upkeep that when the money runs out? Could also look at payback mechanisms. Dewey Humboldt has a really interesting program, or had one a few years ago, where the town put aside money. Then property owners could essentially take out a loan to pay someone to do the work on their property, and then they'd pay back the town over time. That worked really well for folks who can't make that big payment up front. And the other motivating factor in this kind of stuff seems to be interest in hearing adjacent landowners or public landowners or public land managers doing the work. So what can you bring to the table if we do this, and vice versa? So those kinds of cross-boundary partnerships. Next slide. Third theme I want to mention is there's a really critical need to build a bridge between what we know to the actions themselves. There's a lot of research on the education action gap. People know all kinds of stuff about fire. It doesn't mean they act on it. We're noticing in Arizona and many other places, behavioral actions are a lot easier to adopt than structural, kind of physical stuff because of the cost barrier there. So some of this comes down to packaging information and putting, do this action and here's how you do it or when you do it. That's the kind of full package there. That could look like smoke adaptation when you turn on your HEPA filter. We did some survey work in parks between Flagstaff and Williams recently, and a lot of people wanted apps or websites about air quality. They said they didn't have access, but there's all kinds of stuff out there. So it really is just partnering people with the information they're looking for. When it comes to home ignition zone actions, that might be different levels. If you have no funds right now, what can you do? If you have $500, what can you do? If you've got this many hours, what can you do? So connecting the next step. And I'll also mention that these benchmark fires we're seeing, the LA fires recently, Camp Fire, a lot of these big kind of nationally notable ones are great opportunities to have those conversations. The most critical piece of those conversations, I think, is drawing the parallels between the community you work in and what you saw there. So maybe the structures are the same or the evacuation challenges are the same, kind of bringing it home locally, because we only get maybe 6 months of public interest after something like that to act. Next slide. The fourth theme I'll touch on is insurance is such a big talking point in communities, especially in the last year now. And the conversation is, well, what can I do to keep it? So that's a really promising conversation, I think, that people are starting to think more proactively. They want to know what actions will help them retain coverage. And I'll just say that I think this is really time sensitive. There's a lot of interest right now in working to retain it. It's only a matter of time before it could go the direction of more fatalistic. Well, there's nothing I can do. We're at this really nice sweet spot right now where homeowners are really curious about what they can do to retain insurance. So I don't think we want to pass up this opportunity. I'll also say that the cascading consequences of underinsurance, I do a lot of research outside of Arizona as well. I'll draw a little bit from the Marshall Fire. when we were out there interviewing folks, a lot of people were underinsured, and then they built back bigger houses with the kind of idea that if you sell that on, you'll get more money for it, and that'll recoup the losses from your underinsurance. Now we have way bigger houses on the same lot size next to each other, so that's a different kind of challenge. So this is a great opportunity for local municipalities, counties to talk about what building, permitting, kind of those codes after fire could look like ahead of time, so that we're not trying to figure out, well, where are we going to hold the line on what people rebuild in the aftermath of a fire? Have it ahead of time. Next slide. And the last thing I'll touch on is we see this all over the West, but really optimistic risk perceptions that it's maybe lower than it is, or that risk stays low a lot longer after a fire. Some examples from our research: the Schultz fire area burned in 2010. We already had the pipeline and tunnel fire through that just over 10 years later. There was a lot of conversation that it had burned, so it would be a long time before another fire passed through. So kind of drawing attention to that cycle, that the risk doesn't stay down as long as you think it might. We also did a lot of survey work after the museum and Schultz fire flood events, and folks were dropping their post-fire flood insurance at around the 2-year mark. We know that post-fire flooding lasts a lot longer than that in many places. So that seems to be a point at which we should start communicating, hey, keep this going if you can afford it. And then the other example I'll give is just really retroactive smoke adaptation. There's a lot of rural communities who are very indifferent to smoke impacts. As we start to see more prescribed fire, more managed fire, we're going to have more smoke in the air. How do we get those folks to kind of make the connection? So kind of wrapping up this slide, being specific about communication that clarifies the duration, the timing, the fluctuation of risk. It's not always the same, and it can come back a lot faster than we think. Next slide. So I'll just wrap up with some takeaways here. The big overarching theme across all of this research in the last 5 years is Arizona is at this really kind of sweet spot opportunistically to start thinking more outside of the box about how we get adaptation happening. And one of the nice things about that is communities are really ready to come to the table now, more so than they maybe have been in the past, to experiment on different things. Maybe we design a program together. Maybe we try a new mechanism. They're interested in that kind of stuff, pretty much statewide right now. I'll also just mention that Southern Arizona, there's a different kind of vibe down there. A lot of questions about what fire adaptation looks like. What does a fuel break look like in Sonoran Desert? What does a firewise house look like in Patagonia, Sonoyta, Elgin? These places where we weren't necessarily talking about fire before. That uncertainty is a great catalyst for getting people together to kind of muddle through what's good ecologically and what's supported socially. We have a really unique opportunity there right now. And the last thing I'll say is a lot of the success of these programs comes down to community identity. If you're bringing something into a community or trying to introduce something and it doesn't align with who they are, no matter how good it isn't going to work. So thinking about who the people are, how they'll receive it, making those kind of flexible adjustments will make things a lot more sustainable in the long run. Okay. That's the end. I got one last slide with my email address, and I'll just say we have so many publications and fact sheets and white papers. I'd love to share them if anyone's interested down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Very interesting presentation. Are there any comments or questions from the council in the room?
Hi, Kat. I'd be really interested to know, you made some really interesting points about Firewise. I think that has kind of echoed a little bit of what we heard in this council so far, to the point where it's great to have, there is a lot of use, but there may be instances, like you said, where people are maybe spending the money on common areas where it's not as beneficial to kind of the end goal of being resilient towards wildfires. Do you have any, and additionally, you mentioned how those aren't really effective for ranching communities. Have you identified anything where, any alternatives or other things you could share?
Yes, that's a great question. I'd say to start with, we put a lot of weight on Firewise communities as kind of the end goal. A lot of county, state level, I think, grants kind of prioritize places that have Firewise, just because a community that doesn't have that plaque out front doesn't mean that they're not doing this work. So the first step, I think, is kind of acknowledging that there are informal ways to be firewise that look very different, or maybe they just don't have the ability to come together and write that report and do all those things. So first step is not kind of making it black and white. You're either firewise or you're not when that plaque isn't there. Then to the second part of your question, what can we do with communities that maybe Firewise doesn't resonate with? There's kind of two directions we could go. First is developing new programs or having some new ideas about what we might do to kind of document. We always need metrics for stuff. Like, how do we know what's going on in those places? So it might be the development of something different from Firewise, Ranchwise, something along those lines. The other piece would be coming to those places and seeing if it's not programs, what is it? In Oregon and Idaho, there's a lot of interest among ranchers to get red carded because they're not leaving their property, even if you ask them to during a fire. So they ended up creating rangeland fire protection associations, and essentially they're now able to click in with a radio frequency during fires. They have a set level of training. They're going to be there anyway. Let's do it safely. So actions like that, where we're kind of meeting them in the middle. If they're already going to be taking a set kind of trajectory during a fire or after, what can we do to help them do that safely? So there's a lot of different shades to that, and I'd say they don't all have to be programmatic, but I'll say things like working with chambers of commerce on programs is another space. We've had a lot of success in Pine Top Lakeside working with Chamber of Commerce there. So could be a whole suite of things. I think the place we're getting stuck right now is the need to formalize everything when some of this stuff is happening, and we can acknowledge that too.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Edgley. Thank you for your work to help us understand what's happening around Arizona. You know, you mentioned Firewise, and Firewise is a voluntary program, and it's largely driven by the energy of the people who are there at the time. And it has limitations, but it's also been fairly effective in educating people. But I'm wondering, in your research in Arizona, have you all explored the possible acceptance of more mandatory requirements, such as WUI codes or things that are not voluntary but more enforceable and perhaps more effective?
This is a great question. I think there's a lot of question about, well, maybe we should just push everything forward with regulation. There's definitely a lot more interest than there used to be and a lot more acceptance. But I'd say on the spectrum of acceptance of regulation, the extremes are getting further and further apart. There are communities, if you already have homeowners association, you already have a structure, you're probably going to be amenable to a little bit more work. And we definitely saw that in Prescott, that if you have that structure, you might be interested in a little bit more regulation. On the other end of things, there are places that are getting deeper and deeper into we don't want any regulation here. And I think the conversation there is, well, what would you do to not be regulated? What are you willing to do yourselves to not have that oversight? So if the oversight is the concern, well, if you do X, Y, Z on your property, we're not going to come and regulate it. Might be the approach instead. So I think we can flip it around in those spaces. Challenge still exists that there are places where we also don't have the structure when we're outside of like cities or towns that have a regulatory body, might come at the county level. Not all counties are going to want to get into that. But what we've seen in other places, we did some work in Utah and Wyoming a few years ago on how far people would be willing to go with regulation. What we notice is the level of government that administers it matters. If you're having some kind of back and forth with the county about something, maybe it needs to come from another body, the homeowners association or something else. So in those places, I think the question is, what is the right scale to have that conversation, rather than assuming it's going to be the county or the town everywhere.
Thank you.
Anybody else in the room with a question? Are there any online? Okay. All right. Let's move over to Frank with Cal Poly.
All right, thank you. Just for the record, while she's pulling that slide up, it shows me as a PhD on the agenda, and I do not have a PhD. I'm the dreaded ABD, so I just want to be clear on that. I've been there. I'm glad someone with capable hands is doing that. Very good. Thank you. Next slide, please. So as we approach this work, we looked at it from the standpoint of what are we responding to? We've had fire for a long time. We've certainly burned lots of acres. I myself personally, as a practitioner, I don't think it's almost embarrassing, but it probably wasn't until about 2015 that I really felt like, after all the things I was seeing on the ground for a long time, that they were actually changing. And so what I really believe we're responding to, all this attention, it is about unacceptable levels of life and property loss in the WUI. It's not necessarily we're just having more wildfires out, on the landscape. Next click, please. So if you compare these 2 decades, 1999 to 2009, and then the next decade, 2010 to 2020, almost a 250% increase in structures destroyed. And that's a significant push. We know that most of those are human caused. But it's not just that we're losing more structures. Next click, please. It's the density of structure loss as well, which is not a big surprise. It burns into WUI communities. They're tightly packed. So it's taking less acres to get more losses than it used to. Next slide. So why now? We believe that there are 3 incremental changes over time that have kind of hit a tipping point. Next click. Significant increase in fuel loading. Now, to be clear, this doesn't cover everything. We have some areas across the West that are seeing return intervals that are too high from human ignition. But generally, since early 1900s, we asked for a policy of full suppression, and it made good sense for timber and some other things. The unintended consequences are the increases in the fuel, and I'll pull some examples here shortly. Next click. More development in fire-dependent landscapes. Most of these landscapes have a need to have fire on them at some return interval. It does vary, but it's supposed to be there. That's really been noticeable since about the end of World War II in the West, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. Next slide, or next click. Thank you. The last part of this, for me, I had always grown up looking at relative humidity, but it wasn't until I got introduced this concept of vapor pressure deficit that part of this discussion about weather made a big difference. So if you take 2 equal air masses and they're both at 50% relative humidity, if one's warmer than the other, it will hold more water vapor in suspension. And it has remarkably more capacity to hold more water vapor in suspension. If you see, in the afternoons, you'll see clouds form near mountains, right? And so you have an air mass, it's at a certain temperature. As it gets orographically lifted and cools, you start to build some clouds in there. When you do that at a regional or a national level, think of it as a sponge. The sponge is bigger. It can hold more water in suspension. Droughts can go longer and deeper. And then when it precipitates, that big sponge gets squeezed and you have a lot more, and some people are calling, hydraulic whiplash, where you go from drought to flooding. And that also changes the dynamic of how the fuels and the soils retain water. And so those things combined have got us to this tipping point, in our opinion. Next slide. You can read faster than I can, but as we were doing, there's a project that we're doing here in Arizona, actually, that we'll have a chance to discuss briefly. But as we were doing the research to come in and work with the Arizona Fire Chiefs Association, I've found this piece. I thought it was just excellently written back from 2020. And you see the same thing play out through other states in the West. Invasive species come in, different return intervals for fire. Fires can go faster. You've got higher density of fuels, and we're just not in the same environment that we used to be. So our legacy approaches in all kinds of things, whether it's insurance, fuels treatment, suppression, building, they're coming out of a legacy period that doesn't really exist on the ground anymore. Next slide. So this slide, and click it one more time. I had a hard time finding this. So I believe that's the Arizona line right there. So you're not in as bad a shape as some of the other states, but you clearly are seeing a lot of growth. I was actually a lumberjack briefly at NAU some time ago, and every time I fly through here, I'm amazed at how much growth there's been. But you can see across the board, most of it started after World War II. So just examples that we're putting more development in the western states in terms of just straight up population density. Next slide. One of the other things that I think is new is we're starting to realize a lot of our thinking comes out of fire intensity and specifically stand replacement fires. If we're talking about forests as a natural resource, we look at intensity. That's where a lot of our DNA and the thinking comes. But what the research is starting to reveal is its speed in terms of WUI losses. It's speed that correlates really well to property loss. It's an excellent paper by Jennifer Balch and her team out of University of Colorado Boulder. So, when you can look at speed, and for the fire practitioner, it's not a big surprise, but to really see the numbers and the research, it's stunning. And so part of what we have to rethink is it's ignitions close to communities and flashy fuels under extreme conditions. You have very little time to mount a response. You usually have less time to evacuate. And then you start that disaster sequence that we probably understand from Jack Cohen, where these start as wildfires, but they only last that way for a short period. Once they get into the structures under those conditions, it's an old-fashioned Dresden conflagration. That's what we're dealing with. And the reason we don't have that on windy days where it's just a structure fire is we don't have the multiple ignitions simultaneously across the boundary of a community. That's what overwhelms the initial response. If we, thank you. Next slide, please. That was great anticipation. So I got permission to use this slide from the Carey Institute. Park Williams and Winslow Hansen have been doing some work in this space, and they looked at the correlation over time between vapor pressure deficit and acres burned. Next slide, please. I try to choose my words carefully, and I hesitated using frightening, but it's the right word. We're about to enter a period, and I'll reference Georgia Box here. All models are wrong. Some are helpful, right? But that said, we use models for everything. And so if you look at kind of this standard issue modeling that you would apply here, we're about to enter a multi-decade period where the average will be 2 to 3 times our peak lived experience. 2 to 3 times, the average will be 2 to 3 times our peak lived experience. We're coming at the leading edge of this from a legacy standpoint, and whether it's public policy, the markets, building, construction, public policy, we don't have the right playbook yet. We can't come at this with an old set of approaches. Next slide. And next click, please. So I think one of my aha moments was as a fire chief, I had my inspectors out. They had done a garden variety defensible space inspection, 2 thumbs up, great job, gold star. So on a Monday or Tuesday, before the week was out, they got a non-renewal notice from their insurance carrier for too much wildfire risk. And as you can imagine, they called their fire chief, the supposed professional, and I could not answer their question. And that's really what personally started me down this road. How could the fire service look at the same piece of property and adjacent land and come to a completely different conclusion than the risk transfer industries? What I've come to find out is that neither of us were wrong, but we're looking at it in different ways. And consequently, we're not giving a uniform message to the public, and certainly not to individual property owners. We're literally at sometimes telling them different things, recognizing different things, not recognizing others. Next click. As I said earlier, just legacy data and systems are not going to work here. We're trying to extend an old playbook into a future that doesn't really exist anymore. So we have to, Dr. Edgley's point, I forget which theme it was, but we have to start changing our thinking here and soon. Next clip. I believe we cannot suppress, regulate, or price our way out of this. We'll need to continue to do all 3 of these. But I believe we need to add and make preeminent retroactive mitigation to the existing inventory of structures in WUI communities. Until we change conditions on the ground at scale, we're not going to change the outcomes. Simply not going to happen. And if the work out of the Carey Institute is correct, it's not going to level off. It's going to get worse. It's going to get much worse. Next. My attempt at trying to think through this from a policy perspective is as follows. Click. The good news is, and I started this with this disconnect between, the insurance industry and the fire service. We both want the same outcome. We don't want to have any property loss. Physics of fire are the same. Yes, it's unique on the fuel types and those types of things, but the conflagration loss sequence, how you transfer heat from vegetation and spots into structures and then structure to structure, that is the same everywhere. So if we want the same outcome, why in the world would we look for different things on the property? And yet I found out we were looking at it completely different. Next click. So, and my focus is on the existing inventory of structures. We have all kinds of mechanisms to build new construction. But if we don't solve the existing inventory problem, we won't be able to build a whole lot of new stuff for various reasons. So essentially it's 3 layers. You start at the shell of the structure and you try to make it unreceptive to embers. That's the first step. Then immediately adjacent to that, the defensible space, it'll change based on lot line. Going anything out past 100 feet, you start to hit diminishing returns. First 5 feet, the research is just compounding that's a very, very critical space. We'll see that the distances at about 50 to 70 feet are really key. But that work is both necessary and insufficient. Those first 2 layers are really about low intensity, low duration heat flux from embers and ground fire connective fuels. But when you start having a structure burn for 30 to 40 minutes in a sustained 50-mile-an-hour wind, it completely outperforms those first 2 mitigation envelopes. So you have to get this stuff done at scale when you've got the right density of structures. Otherwise, it's not going to make a difference. But for the most part, we haven't done that. What we went to, next click please, is we went to the things we were familiar with. We went to risk policy focus and effort. We were changing the way we look at rate making for insurance. We were, trying to take different types of maps and sort of redefine what we were seeing. We started to evaluate what are the risk contagion to other financial markets. Those are all very, very important things, but none of them change conditions on the ground. It doesn't matter how many ways we try to redefine this or take kind of lapse of admiration at the problem. Until we change conditions on the ground, the consequences aren't going to get better. They're going to get worse. Next, please. So it's always dangerous when you start flirting with existing wording, but I'm going to take a shot at it here because I think we need to. First click. So we're thinking of a WUI community. Doesn't have to have a name. It's 100 or more structures where the average structure separation distance is less than 50 feet in 50% of the cases. That's just a fancy way to say that the structures are close enough in the conditions we care about to transfer heat from one structure to another with structures as the primary fuel type. Next click. The interface that I grew up with was used differently than this, but we see it as really kind of a donut. This is about 100 feet out into the vegetative landscape that will carry wildfire at the perimeter of the community to about 2 layers of structures inside. It's probably the least scientific part of this, but drawing on my practitioner experience in those conditions, I can't think of one time where I got 2 layers of structures going and I've actually made a difference. You got to wait till the wind stops. So that's the base behind that one. And then the third one, next click, is really this sphere of influence on the perimeter. I feel that if we had, we can't do everything everywhere all at once. And if we're going to prioritize, if we're really reacting to WUI losses, our first and prioritized treatment of landscape level fuels needs to be in that last half to a quarter mile around the WUI communities. That's your final approach into the community. The research is starting to make it really clear. I think Dr. Balch's work really looks at that 4-kilometer space. But as you dig into it a little bit more, it really starts to get closer than that. And we just can't retreat the entire Western US. It's not possible. There's no financially, way to do that. Next click. So looking at it that way, what we're doing is trying to disrupt propagation of heat, fire, in these three pathways concurrently: structure to structure, vegetation to structure, which is kind of the transition, and then vegetation to vegetation on final approach. So our work is really about, it's brutally straightforward. How do you disrupt propagation of heat across those three pathways intentionally and concurrently? Next slide. Twice this week, I read in some pretty prominent publications that we don't have any structure to structure models that we can use. I know of at least one exception to that, and I'm sharing it here. So this is work from Dr. Hussam Mahmood out of Colorado State University at Fort Collins. Just about anybody with a crayon and some imagination can circle a WUI community and say, you know what, I think we're going to lose 80% of the structures here. Thank you. I'm more interested in models that can figure out what's likely to be saved, what's likely to survive. So this is observed damage on the left is from the campfire. As you all know, I'm sure under these conditions, once you ignite a structure, if there's no defensive action, it'll usually burn to completion. So you usually have damaged or undamaged, red or blue. The model that he's using, I think it's called the Agninor model. The trigger point or tipping point for him on that, if you look on the scale to the right, is about 0.72. So if you look at the colors that would fall just about at that 0.72 mark on the right, so it's light blues and cayennes to dark, and you look at the picture on the right, and you look at the picture on the left, you don't have to be a statistician to see that there's some pretty good correlation there. We don't have the time today, but I've pressed them a little bit because I helped fund them. So that's good, but we need more. We need to know where the pathway in the structures is, and I need to know the time component. How long will it take to go through there? There was some really compelling evidence from the Lahaina fire that it was able to do, where we could run actual verifiable losses of structure by location, by time, and run that same time scale against his model. And I was mightily impressed. There are two other models I'm aware of in the US that are starting to work on that, one out of University of Buffalo and one out of UC Berkeley. Los Alamos National Labs invited me to a WUI symposium, and they're just starting to dig into this. So there may be some early ones there, but they're pretty nascent. In the insurance industry, we have proprietary models, but to be honest, I've not had a whole lot of look, even though they're NDA, to have a high level of understanding about them. They certainly are getting better. They're catching up. But one of the things I realized, the insurance industry never had to look at it with that kind of granularity in the past. Wildfire was a secondary peril. It was pretty predictable. And, what they were doing was sufficient. But for the incremental change reasons I discussed earlier, that's not what we're dealing with now. And so we have to have the granularity. We have to figure out what mitigations matter. What's the efficacy? Next slide. And right here, for the sake of time, I think what I'll do is I'll pause, and we have a couple slides that maybe they'll be better to bring up in Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Is there any questions in the room? Yes, Jake.
I just had a quick question. So, when we're approaching this issue, the way you mentioned it is, we're not going to be able to retreat the entire Western US, but also at the same time, we don't need to maybe focus on newer structures. And so, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of what you're talking about is about retrofitting existing structures and also trying to, mitigate fuel sources around them. And I just wonder, that seems like a pretty tough problem in and of itself. Have you identified kind of any strategies that anyone else is trying to take to incentivize this or fund this? Or I would love to hear about them.
Yes, it's an excellent question. We've done a pilot to this effect out of Rancho Mission Viejo. If you look up Rancho Mission Viejo and Milliman, that's an actuarial group we've worked with. There's about an hour-long video that you can look at, and there's some Q&A in there. But that is a an illustration of concept in a master plan development coming out of the ground under California Chapter 7A, which is arguably the most rigorous code, and a new development coming out of the ground with the most rigorous WUI code. The reason they called me is because they couldn't finish a phase. This is like a 15 or 20-year development. They couldn't finish a phase because the buyers couldn't get insurance. Now, if a new development under the most restrictive code cannot get insured, can you imagine what the rest of the market looks like? I mean, that's a connection that we have to make. So the idea is to take those variables that disrupt propagation of fire in those three pathways, understand their contribution to the probability of transfer, and then turn those into actuarial variables so that for the first time we can start to put a financial value on the mitigations. Because at some point we have to make that pencil out, whether it's to have a healthy private sector, or if we think we're going to take it over at the government side, we still have to understand what is effective and what is not. And we currently haven't been able to do that. I hope that answered your question.
Any other questions? Yes.
And I think this might be for both of you here. I know in the last presentation, you talked about, rebuilding after major wildfire and what sort of building codes the new structures are going to be applicable. I'm more interested to hear, I guess, from the both of you, if there's any research on land use practices as it relates to wildland urban interface communities. Is there best practices? I know in your presentation, you talked a lot about density and, the issue with structure to structure fires. It's coming from vegetation. Now it's hitting structures. Is there any best practices that you've seen in your research to suggest, this is how, the land use practices should be deployed as we're starting to build out our urban environment? Because in a lot of these wild urban interface communities, there's a lot of subdivisions that are going up and what would otherwise have been just greenfield areas. And then when you factor in, communities like Paradise and probably Palisades now that they're going to be rebuilding, is there best practices from a land use perspective on how these communities should be managing that rebuild and that future growth?
I'm going to say this is a little out of my wheelhouse. I don't know a huge amount in this space, so I might pass it off to you if that's okay. Sorry.
As long as you'll cover me later, I'm sure I'll do. Yes, it's an excellent question. I point right now to two mitigation packages that I think we could start on yesterday. One is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety Wildfire Prepared Home designation. They are just releasing, I just got to look at the draft of the Wildfire Prepared Neighborhood. It's too early for me to comment on that, but the Wildfire Prepared Home designation package of mitigations is absolute. We could get started on that yesterday. The second one that's very, very practical and well done is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies Technical Note 2205. It's on hazard mitigation methodology. And there are very clear examples of how you could implement some planning guidelines on densities and setbacks and different things. So very good there. One of the, as we're talking about having to find a new way to do things, we've put together a pretty extensive advisory council for the Institute. But maybe they're listening. I need to get the Urban Land Institute involved because that portion is going to be key. And it's not so much to your question earlier that we need to not pay attention to new construction. New construction always becomes old construction. But it's that if we just say, well, we're going to put our effort in new construction, we've got, I think, well over 45 million existing structures in the Western US that are not going to be removed. They're not going to be deconstructed. And the financial systems will not carry the shock of that. So we'll kind of perish on the way to building new things if we don't take care of the existing structures as well. Did I answer your question? Very good. Yeah, I'm going to be here staying overnight so we can catch up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Catherine, I just had one more question for you specifically, because you're talking about kind of, socially people's, and please forgive me if I misstate this, but like people's like willingness to kind of participate in these type of practices. Whenever we hear about this, it feels like eating an elephant. And I think I've said that twice now, because it requires, retrofitting old structures, changing how people treat the landscapes around their homes, things that are pretty, as I understand them, and I could be wrong, like high in cost. Has your research done any, I mean, people might be willing to do these things, but with the cost, I think that's a big barrier, and the funding has to come from somewhere. So have you explored anything about, how you're trying to get these retrofitting done, but there's all these kind of obstacles?
That is a great question. I haven't done anything explicitly on that, but I'll say a few kind of indications. First one is we're not going to be able to do it overnight, like you mentioned. So when is the right time? Is that providing rebates that when people go to get a new roof, now there's the incentive to go up a level with some subsidization there, recognizing that that's a one-off big expense for most households. So it's not something where that we're going to require them to upkeep it. The other space I think we can use strategically is kind of, I'm calling it value stacking. If it's beneficial to something else, people are more likely to do it. So if you go to a community and say, we want a fuel break around the outside, that might be a tough sell. If you're now saying, well, actually, it could be a cross-country ski trail as well, and it's going to change the property value in your area, that's a much more compelling conversation. So what can we do to say on the individual property level, how much of an impact does that have on your property value, on aesthetics, on other pieces? When we talk about air filtration, it's not just smoke, it's dust, it's pollen, it's all these other things. How do we bundle it together in ways that make it appealing? I think that's a strategy when we don't have the funds readily available to be thinking about. And again, that's going to be different for every community. So figuring out what is the value that you stack. An example right now, we're working with Patagonia, Arizona, talking a lot about the mine coming in there, and then using that community value, that concern, to then talk about, okay, well, is that going to introduce more human ignitions? Fire is a part of that conversation, even though it's not the center of that universe. So finding ways to fit it in, even if it's not the top priority, I think is a good strategy when funding isn't super abundant for that kind of stuff.
I want to make sure to answer your question as well. There's actually a program called the Fortified Roof Program that is about actually hurricane protection, but it also provides convective storm protection from hail. I'm pretty sure you get that, maybe not as bad as Colorado, but I'm sure you have pretty decent hail here. It's a great example of, in the replacement of the roof, you're getting not just the fire resistant component, but you're getting something that helps from the convective side as well, as an example. And if I could just really quickly, I always like to show examples of like, we can do this. So if you could click through this slide, we won't cover this one right now. Just keep going until you go to the next. Okay, click. All right, that's a link. If you click on it, it should take you to this webpage. This is the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. Kind of sounds like Insurance Institute for Business Home Safety. Started in 1959. We were using more highways. We were driving more vehicles. Can you scroll straight to the bottom? You go down, way down there. It's going to take you a while. So there were unacceptable levels of life and property. The insurers started to realize, okay, we need to research this. We need to study it. And if you just slowly scroll through there, you'll start to see that they start doing scientific research. Just kind of keep slowly scrolling up. They realize bumpers can make a difference. They look at, they realize they have to have some data that they didn't have before. They start doing crash tests on things. They look at, well, consequences of driving. You can just go through this. I would highly encourage you to do that. Now, initially, the pushback on these from the builders of vehicles were, wait, seatbelts? We never had those before. Why would I want to do that? It's going to cost more money, more time. Airbags. How many of you remember, maybe you shouldn't date yourself. I can remember when if you had some whiz-bang thing called ABS, anti-lock brake system on your car, you got a break on your insurance because the data demonstrated what the actuarial value was of that. Now, if you go in and you buy a car today, you don't make it 20 steps inside the showroom floor before there's a small little kiosk with a clear plexiglass holder for the consumer reports on all the safety elements of that. They finally realized, and we realized as people, we would pay for safety. And for the practitioners in the room, you understand the kind of accidents people didn't survive before. In fact, one of these key things, there were 2 Chrysler LeBarons, it's right there, in a head-on collision, had airbags, both people survived. First time ever that they'd seen anything like that. So I just provide that example. And then quickly, if you go back to the slides, please. Second example. Yeah, just go ahead and click it and then click the next one. If you look at the, go ahead and click to the next slide, please. There you go. One more. If you take the fire reporting data for the U.S. Fire Service from 1980 to 2020, I think it's 2019 on there. Click, please. And what you'll see is that's the national increase in the call volume, right? Click it one more time. This is the percentage of those calls that are fires. Now, in the IBH or the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, took us about 60 years to get to where we're at today, where people are paying for the mitigations that save them, and they're selecting it. We have all kinds of commercials for it. If anybody that's been in the fire service a long time, tell you this is what's happening. Fires rarely leave the room of origin anymore when we do have the ignitions. So we can do this. These are 2 clear examples that we've already done this. We just have to decide if we have the political will to quit trying to approach a new future problem from a legacy perspective. And until we do that, until we change conditions on the ground, we'll keep having these meetings.
I just want to check, was there any questions on the line? Okay. Anybody else in the room? Oh, you're good?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you both so much. We're going to move into presentations from the utilities. If you all want to come up to the table. There'll be 3 separate presentations from the utilities. Let me just make sure they're getting your information up. You guys let me know when you're ready. Okay. All right. I'm going to call on Scott Bordenkircher and Andrew Rabel to introduce themselves and begin the presentation. Apologies if I didn't get your names right.
All good. Good afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm Andrew Rabel. I am the manager of Forestry, Fire, and Resource Management. Also an NAU Lumberjack Forester by education as well.
And I'm Scott Bordenkircher. I'm the Director of Forestry and Fire Mitigation for Arizona Public Service. And Andrew and I will be kind of tag teaming our APS presentation.
Okay, you can go ahead and move into the next slide. So the reason this slide is important is really what this identifies is the APS responsibility when it comes to our service territory. And you can kind of see the shaded area there and what it represents when it comes to the communities that we serve, the geographic representation of the APS footprint, and also, of course, the different eco zones and geographic area of the state, the challenges associated with providing reliable power to those areas across the state, knowing that as you kind of read the bullet items there on the right, some of the elements of what goes into managing the utility, especially when it comes to the volume of miles across such a wide range of geographic territory, in addition to the responsibility when it comes to the equipment that we have done and the impact there on what's been mentioned a number of times with the wildland urban interface. Next slide. So what I'm asking here is for you to take a look at the last 3 years of forestry veg management work that APS has done in comparison to the service territory map that was on the previous slide. And basically what you're looking at here is a geographic representation of the last 3 years of maintenance that has been done when it comes to our rights of way, both distribution and transmission. And knowing, as we kind of looked at that first shaded map, that there is work that does get done across the entire landscape and the state of Arizona with different prescription, with different veg types, with different challenges associated with each amount of work. And when you kind of look at that representation of the work, the other part that's important here is kind of mentioning the differences. And as you go to the next slide, I think it's important to reference the cycle and the units that are attached to each cycle. So we can consider a cycle a measurement in time of when each feeder and cycle is scheduled for that routine maintenance. And knowing that as a utility, our veg management program has been on cycle since 2016. So basically that the interpretation of that is that the company has made an investment in time, in energy, in resources, and dollars, because it's important that we recognize since 2016 that keeping our system on cycle is critical to the overall health and well-being of the communities and the customers that we serve. As you take a look at the unit counts here and the equivalent basically for the understanding today is a unit of measure is a tree or a measurement of vegetation. And this is just quantified the last 3 years as you compare it to the map where we've been spending the majority of our work represented by geographic region and the unit counts over the last 3 years that have been addressed or that have an APS signature as part of our routine maintenance. Next slide. So what you're looking at here is the Horton fire. And I'm sure that a lot of you saw in the news in the last few weeks, we did have a pretty significant burn on the Mogollon Rim area of northern Arizona. And it was the Horton fire that was just contained a couple of weeks ago. This is a picture of our right-of-way that was scheduled for routine maintenance in 2024. So we went through here as part of our regular routine maintenance and addressed the units in our right-of-way. And you can see that our easement there is pretty clear of vegetation. And in this case was used as a tool by the fire crews to anchor, flank, suppress the box that they created around this fire for backburning operations. So this is an example of why we do what we do to protect the communities, but then also, in this case, created a fuel break that the fire suppression crews were able to leverage when it came to the containment of the Horton fire.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you all for giving us the time to talk about this today. I'll cover the comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan that we put in place and execute at Arizona Public Service. We have been doing efforts in fire mitigation for near on a decade now, but certainly as conditions have continued to deteriorate amongst forests and forest health, and as very, very well explained by my academic colleagues that were here earlier, just the mass migration and continual development of the WUI has made this even more critical for us to really look at not only the programs that we had in place, but how we broaden those programs. This is a case where one silver bullet doesn't solve the problem. And so really, how do we put a bunch of things together that each work simultaneously to mitigate risk overall? Andrew covered our vegetation management section very, very well. I feel very strongly that this is the basis of any good utility practice. If you don't have good vegetation management, if you're not handling the right-of-ways, keeping them clear, if you're not eliminating those fuels closest to your facilities, you're fighting a losing battle. And so this is ground zero for us as vegetation management. We add to that right-of-way clearing that Andrew explained two programs. One is our defensible space around poles. It's very similar to defensible space around houses. So for those of our poles that have electrical equipment on it, we clear 10 feet around those poles to make sure that we don't have flammable or ignitable materials below that pole. And then our hazard tree program addresses trees that are dead or dying outside of our right-of-ways. And that's important because it's another step from the standpoint that we don't really own a legal right to operate in those areas. Partnerships are very, very, very key for us here, whether it's private homeowners or publicly managed lands. We need to seek permission and approval for them to remove those trees that, again, are outside our normal legal right-of-ways, but have the potential to strike our facilities and therefore potentially cause fires should they fail. The second pillar that we focus on is grid hardening. So these are things that we do to our equipment in order to either make them more resilient to fire or make them less likely to have a problem or cause a fire if something bad happens to that facility. This is things like system upgrades, changing wood poles out for steel poles, wrapping wood poles in a fire mesh, non-burnable material. There are certain devices in the electrical system that when they operate 100% appropriately as designed, cause sparks to fall. Fuses are a great example of this, but there are new technologies, new version of fuses now called non-expulsion or expulsion limiting fuses that still perform their electrical system task, but don't have that aspect of sparks falling when they operate. And so we're looking at where do we replace those devices? How can we get those out in high fire risk areas? Asset inspections are very, very important to us. We do cyclical inspections of all of our circuit miles, but it depends on what kind of material is there, how old is the circuit, what is it, transmission or distribution, so high voltage or low voltage. But with one exception, and that is our high fire risk areas. We inspect by foot patrol drones and other scanning mechanisms every single mile of lines in high fire risk areas every single year. And we do it before the worst part of fire season, and then we make any corrections and repairs to those facilities as necessary to ensure that we're starting off that season in the best place or best foothold we can possibly be in. The next pillar is around monitoring and awareness. This is one of our largest growth areas at APS. So we now have 3 full-time meteorologists on staff, something that we didn't have previously. Never would have thought that job description might even fit in a utility, but it has been instrumental in giving us the ability to forecast bad days or bad conditions, heavy winds, lower humidity, lack of rain, lack of precipitation, and really given us that leg up and truly understanding where do our risky areas lie. Advanced firing modeling software. The very lower left picture is a picture of that software that we put in last year, and it allows us to actually track or predict where fire is going to go when there's an actual fire burning. It also allows us to run fake scenarios where we can put a fire on a line or on a facility and understand where it might go. That allows us to focus investment. It allows us to focus risk mitigation where it's going to mean the most. If we have 2 fire starts, though I don't want to damage environment, I would hate to burn a forest or a mountain, don't want to do that. I certainly would rather take that, though, obviously, over, for instance, burning down a town or damaging structures and potentially having loss of human life. So that gives us that ability to do those judgment calls. We've put in a whole series of cameras and weather stations. This allows us to have pinpoint accuracy on our facilities, what's happening in real time in those locations. And then one flavor of cameras I'll actually call out separately is our new artificial intelligence fire sensing cameras. So last year we put up our first set of these. We're going to double that quantity this year and probably continue to double in years subsequent. And these cameras actually detect smoke, detect fires when they start. They not only alert us, but they also alert the dispatch centers that are the source or the point where first responding agencies get dispatched to deal with those fires. So if you think about the time that it takes for a fire to spread, if we can shorten that time even by 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes more than an hour, that's a big leg up and a big plus for firefighters that are getting on the ground fast and being able to address that before it grows. Along with that, obviously, comes all of the partnerships that we have with folks, and I'll maybe dig into that just as my closing comments in a moment. Let me switch to our last pillar, which is our operational mitigation. So these are the things that we change or do differently in high fire risk times. So we know that we have parts of our system that are just in high fire risk areas. Clearly on a wonderful, let's call it best case, pouring rain, everything's soaked, not a lot of wind. We probably don't have a big fire issue there. So that's kind of that static assessment of, yeah, it's still a risky area if those conditions aren't. But today it's a rainy day, everything's good. We now look at those times though when, hey, it's a risky area and the environmental conditions are such that that risk is also elevated. We look at those as not only our fire risk areas, but our high fire risk areas in elevated fire conditions. And that's when we actually change our operations. So we will change devices to operate differently. The normal way an outage is handled by our electronic automated equipment is if an outage occurs, the system will wait a certain amount of time and then it will automatically try and re-energize, thus limiting the outage for a customer. In high fire risk time or in high fire level time, we turn that off and we will actually have the outage be maintained. We will walk down that line to make sure the system is okay, the equipment is okay, nothing is in a state where it might catch fire, and then we physically re-energize it. And so that's just one instance. We do things around red flag warnings. So you've all probably heard about that from National Weather Service will issue red flag warnings in an area because again, conditions are just poor, very, very high winds typically are in these circumstances. We'll do the same. We'll limit our work in those areas. We'll actually shut down what we call just kind of our planned work. So if we're just doing maintenance on a line, we probably won't do that in that area that day. We'll only address those things that are emergencies. And then the very last item that we introduced this last year in 2024 was our public safety power shutoffs. This is something that other service territories, other utilities have had now for several years. It's the first time that we as an Arizona utility have had it. Knock on wood, thank goodness, last year we did not actually have to call one. But we recognize that this is an important thing that we still have in our toolbox because at some point, if the conditions get so bad and we can't have any other mechanism in order to ensure that we aren't the cause of an ignition of a catastrophic wildfire, this gives us a mechanism to take that kind of last resort and shut off power and make sure that that can't happen. We don't expect to use this very often, obviously. Hopefully never would be great, but we knew we needed to have it in the toolbox. So that kind of just gives you an idea of the breadth. I'll go back quickly as I close, just in terms of those partnerships. I mentioned several things along here, and Andrew even talked about it in his general vegetation management, how important those partnerships are as it relates to being able to work outside of our normal scope of ownership or scope of legal responsibility, outside those right-of-ways, outside those easements. So when I think about the partnerships with Forest Service, DFFM, BLM, private customers who are willing to have us be able to go on their property and do mitigation steps on both of our behalfs, it's a great honor and a responsibility and a pleasure for us to be able to do that in collaboration, in partnership with those folks. I extend that again then also to things like our AI cameras where we have those partnerships with the dispatch agencies, with the first responders. When we have a fire of any cause around our facilities, very, very, very often we are embedded in those fire incident commands with those folks, boots on the ground, ensuring that if there's anything that we can do to make their job of fighting that fire easier, if that means de-energizing something, if that means rerouting power, all of those partnerships are really critical and important. And I think with that, I will just end and ask if there are any questions.
If it's all right, I'm going to hold off on questions until the end of all three of the presentations. And so we're going to move on. Elvie, I'm going to move on to you.
Chairman and members, thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I am Elvie Barton. I am the Water and Forest Sustainability Senior Manager at Salt River Project. My team and I lead up all of SRP's forest health initiatives. With me here today is also Jace Kirby, who is our Director of Transmission Line Design, Construction, and Maintenance, and also Sarah McCoy, Director of Risk Management, if you do have any questions for those individuals. Before I dive into my presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge the amazing job that APS did on the overview of the individual pieces of their wildfire mitigation plans, and SRP has a very similar wildfire mitigation plan component. So I won't necessarily dive into those pieces that APS covered so well today, but I'm going to cover some things that are a little bit different from SRP's perspective. So next slide, please. Just a really quick next slide. a really quick overview. If you're not familiar with Salt River Project, we are one of the nation's largest public power utilities. We provide reliable, affordable, and sustainable water and power to over 2 million people here in the Phoenix metropolitan area. We are one of the largest raw water providers here in the valley, delivering about 800,000 acre feet of water annually. And that water that we deliver to our customers comes from a 13,000 square mile watershed that stretches up all the way behind the San Francisco Peaks near Flagstaff, all the way to the New Mexico border. Next slide. So diving into SRP's wildfire mitigation plan, you can see there from the goals that we really want to reduce the risk of SRP facilities being involved in a wildfire, but also to protect SRP infrastructure from oncoming wildfires. And as you can tell, our mitigation plan core elements do cover some of the very same elements that APS outlined in theirs, which include the situational awareness, operational practices, emergency response, public safety power shutoffs, vegetation management, system hardening and ruggedization, communications outreach, condition management, and metrics. I'll touch a little bit lightly on our public safety power shutoff and also our veg management before I pivot into something just a little bit different from SRP from a forest health perspective. So next slide, please. So our public safety power shutoff program, like Scott mentioned, is kind of a last resort option, and it really is focused on the high risk potential areas. And for us at SRP, it really is for our customers in Maricopa and Gila counties. And this public safety power shutoff plan is really driven by some of the same criteria that APS highlighted, which is really looking at wildfire threat modeling and on-site observations to really identify those kind of high-risk areas where we would implement a potential shutoff to our customers. Next slide. Here is the map of where our public safety power shutoff customers would lie in. So there's three communities within the SRP service territory, of which we have highlighted that would be a potential for this. We did want to really minimize the amount of impact that we had on our customers. As you can tell, there's just a little bit under 1,600 customers that could be potentially impacted by this. And then we also want to note that, we do try to limit the circuits that we do also have to cut off if this was a risk that we had to take in implementing this shutoff. Luckily, we have not had to implement this program but we are trying to move forward with a lot of the assets management and hardening of those, and also vegetation management practices to really reduce the risk. So that way in the future, we could limit the impact to our customers overall. Next slide. Just like APS also mentioned, we do have a very robust vegetation management program that does focus on not only our transmission lines, so those are the high voltage lands that you see here in the picture, but also on our distribution lines that also have intersections with some of those WUI type areas. And we also ensure that we are having integrated vegetation management practices that create the same things about defensive space around poles, and really making sure that we are clearing the fuels and having fuels reductions as well. And so if you go to the next slide, here's just another example of on the ground of what that kind of ongoing maintenance around our transmission lines looks like as it transects through some of our National Forest System lands. So just pivoting a little bit to our forest health, which is something that's a little bit different in this presentation. So next slide, please. If you are not probably unfamiliar with what this looks like, but the difference between what we call unhealthy versus healthy forest. But on those top two slides, you can see where this is kind of the conditions that we are experiencing across the three watersheds in northern, central, and eastern Arizona, where you have the dense competition of trees, which creates limited resources of nutrients and water for those trees. And we're really seeing hundreds, if not thousands, of trees per acre across these watersheds and some of these ecosystems. If you look at the pictures on the bottom, you can see it from the landscape view and on the ground view, where when you go and implement thinning type treatments, you are creating more spaces between the trees, less competition, creating more resilient trees that are going to be less likely to succumb to high severity fires, disease, and insect infestations. You create for the understory vegetation to return, and you also are looking at typically about 50 to 200 trees per acre. And this is kind of what we are kind of aiming for, our desired conditions on the ground. So recognizing that SRP delivers water from these watersheds and these kind of unhealthy forest conditions. Next slide, please. SRP took the initiative to adopt a 2035 forest health goal, and that is to help support the thinning of 800,000 acres by 2035. And this is really a collective action of bringing of people together, of partners, and trying to scale the pace and of restoration across these watersheds to protect not only the communities that intersect with these forests, but also to protect infrastructure and water supplies. Next slide. So SRP, we are not the land manager of most of the lands across these three watersheds. So the only way that we're actually going to able to achieve that level of a goal is really through collaboration and partnerships. One of our key partnerships is with the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management and the U.S. Forest Service, where we have long-term MOUs and commitments to help thin thousands of acres across national forest lands over the next 10 years. Through that partnership, we have now been able to scale that partnership to 4 different forests, so Coconino, Prescott, Tonto, and now the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. We also work with a number of other different implementing partners, including the Arizona Game and Fish Department, National Forest Foundation, Mule Deer Foundation, and the Arizona Elk Society as implementing partners, knowing that we need to leverage all of our partners' capacity to really scale the amount of restoration that needs to occur. In addition to that, we have a number of different funding partnerships and mechanisms that we use to scale this partnership. So we have funding partnerships at the federal, state, and local government level, nonprofit level, foundations, and also SRP customers as well. One of our top programs that we get asked a lot about is our Resilient Water and Forest Initiative, which is our program that's aimed at our corporate customers that help invest in on-the-ground restoration projects, and we provide them with quantified environmental co-benefits associated with their investments. And so you can see those companies listed as Coca-Cola, Google, Pepsi, Apple, EdgeCore, Swire Coca-Cola, and Meta as some of our first investors in on-the-ground restoration projects. So that's a really exciting and new opportunity to leverage all the people coming to the table to really help achieve landscape scale restoration objectives. So next slide. And I always kind of like to end on a little bit of a positive note here. Through SRP's partnerships with our number of implementing and funding partners, we have over 20 plus different types of partners that have come to the table to help really scale this work, which just shows the magnitude of the interest and the awareness that people want to participate in these type of level of projects. We've been able to, over the last 4 years, to leverage over $20 million in partner funding and commitments to date. And again, that ranges all the way from the federal to down to local governments, nonprofits, and private corporations. To date, through our partners, we have been able to fund 87,000 acres of restoration across Tonto, Coconino, and Prescott National Forest. And SRP has committed to partnering on another 56,000 acres over the next 10 years. And then over the last few years, we have completed over 14,000 acres across 3 national forests. But that is also a lagging indicator. And so we know that the pace of actual on-the-ground implementation will start to reach the levels of acres that we have funded every single year and have committed to do so. So I just wanted to end up on a really positive note, and also just a big thank you to all of our partners across the board that are willing to step up and be a part of this really an innovative funding partnership to scale restoration, protect communities, and protect water supplies. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Tucson Electric Power. Larry Robinson.
Yeah.
He's online.
Okay, can you guys hear me fine?
Yes, we can. If you'll introduce yourself and they'll start your presentation.
Yeah, perfect. My name is Larry Robinson. I'm the Director of Engineering here at Tucson Electric Power. Sorry, I couldn't be there in person, but I had some conflicts that wouldn't allow me to travel to Phoenix. Yeah. So if you want to go next slide, and you can go ahead and go to the next one also. So I'll just do a brief overview of what the company's assets and our customer base looks like. I'll give you an update on where we are in our wildfire mitigation plan and our processes, what we're changing there. We'll talk about asset management, which is really about control. Update to our operational facilities. And then talk more about our transmission distribution inspections and the programs that we do to keep our systems functional and at low risk. So just finally, I'll talk about management and what our 2025 priorities are. So if you want to go next slide. I just wanted to update before I go into this slide. Jason, Dot, and myself, and WAPA, we all work together. We have monthly meetings and coordination between utilities to talk about what we're doing to lower risk of utilities and igniting fires, coordinate our efforts, and to try to meet the interest of our customers and the state. So we are doing that on a regular basis. You're going to see a lot of common practices here that SOP and APS talked about already. And I'll try to just talk about some of the differences of what we have going on here. UNS is a company combined of Tucson Electric Power and Unisource Energy Services. Combined, we have just over 700,000 customers. And with those 700,000 customers, we have over almost 2,000 miles of transmission line, and we've been serving the Tucson community for 125 years. We employ just under 1,900 employees between both entities. And you can see our service territories here. We have the Tucson and surrounding areas. We have electric service up in the Kingman, Lake Havasu areas, and Nogales for gas, and that gray shaded area is our gas distribution for our system. You can also see an outline of where our generation facilities and our transmission facilities are. Several of these lines are co-owned and operated by APS and SRP. Next slide. So this slide, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we have been doing over the past few years on our, actually for over 12 years, we've been using, this is the US Forest Service GS map for fire risk. And this is what we have primarily been using to assess our regional and area fire risk. And we will do additional patrols based on how this map changes over time, but this doesn't get updated frequently enough to be anything more than a long-range planning tool. So we have adopted a new service provider. Cloudfire is a service provider that does a local regional assessment of our service territories, and they have given us information on what fire risks are local to not only Unisource Electric and Kingman Havasu, Nogales separately, and Tucson Electric Power service territory. That's resulted in about 20% of our system that is being assessed as the highest tier risk that will be monitoring at a higher level of assessment and operational perspectives, and are potentially subject to public safety power shutoffs. Next slide. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about our clearing activities and our wildfire risk monitoring and response. As you can see here, this is a picture of our transmission system over in western New Mexico. We've provided and done like all of the other sister utilities, have a clear-cut scenario for our 345 lines that results in a much lower risk configuration for the lines themselves and a much lower risk probability of fire ignition to the communities that are around. This is valuable for us because these become even defensible spaces for fires, and the firefighters that are fighting fires, they plan on these corridors in responding to wildland fires that are lightning caused or human caused outside of our transmission systems and other facilities. We monitor our fire starts right on a daily basis. We recently got a notice that we had a 30-acre fire up by Luna, New Mexico, out in the Reserve Fire District, U.S. Fire District. So each day we are monitoring our daily fire starts. Normally this time of year we don't have anything, but as we all know, the effects of drought and climate change have drastically changed when fire season can start. And so now we monitor these sites on a daily basis and move forward. So next slide. So these are just some of the key aspects of our wildfire mitigation plan, the components that are associated with this. The purpose of this plan is to reduce the risk that our electric utilities would be the ignition source of a wildland fire, and also reduce the risk that a fire that does get started will spread and become a significant fire in the future. You can see that the components of that are situational awareness, operational practices, emergency response, vegetation management, condition management, which is what I'll talk more about on our asset management program, hardening and ruggedization, and communications and outreach to our different stakeholders and partners, right? In doing these areas, right, our operational management practices include activities such as seasonal maintenance, like APS talked about. There are times when we're on red flag warning days where we cease to do our normal maintenance activities. We would restrict things like welding or open flame uses for our maintenance activities, and we also would make sure that all of our crews have on-board fire extinguishers, wildland fire tools like water pumpers, shovels, and Pulaskis. In addition to that, we want to make sure that our crews are using these different activities, and in our emergency response and protocols, we would change our operational configurations to no longer use reclosing, take that out of service. We've also looked at those different activities to do fast trip response. However, we have not got that in service and in regulation yet. We are looking at what the requirements are for our systems to be able to update and utilize fast trip response for this type of information. Next slide. We just want to talk about in this slide some of the complexities and the contributors to our asset management process, right? We have contributing interest from our customers. We have regulatory stakeholders that invest in this. We have our actual investors from our forest companies and our commercial environments. We have our organization and people that come up with our strategies. Our asset management decision-making processes are informed by our asset condition assessments and the information that we're getting back from our inspections. All of that feeds into a circular loop that defines where we are going to invest our money to harden our system. And wildfire mitigation is now a key component and a key consideration to where we're investing our hardening, our system hardening, to try to reduce the potential risk to our system and risk to the customers that are involved at these higher risk tiers from our fire assessment. Our next slide, I'll talk a little bit about our asset management team and what we look at in our substations. We look at all of our equipment, including substation transformers, breakers, distribution breaker replacement, relay and communication equipment to make sure that they are operational and functional. In our distribution side, we have a distribution replacement program that is ramping up to over 1,000 poles more than we have been doing historically to try to harden our system from wood poles to steel poles. We have added a distribution visual drive-by inspection that occurs on a 3-year cycle that gives us an opportunity to see priority 1, priority 2 type assessments for risk that can be corrected immediately without causing outages on our system. And in our transmission system, we not only utilize ground patrols, but we utilize drones and aerial patrols to keep our system in functional order. We have a 138 wood placement structure replacement program and our anchor replacement program for our 345 system. Next slide. So this talks a little bit about our line inspections, both on our transmission side. The last slide will be on distribution. So each year we do a 100% inspection of our 138 transmission system and our 500 kV transmission system. That system is more local to our service territory. Our 345 system is very remote, so we do biannual inspections via helicopter twice a year on our 345 system, and we follow that up with a 5-year ground inspection on our 345 system. Unisource Electric is a little bit different. They don't have any extra high voltage in their system, but they do yearly aerial inspections and ground inspections based on what is seen from the air. So if we make an observation out of our helicopter, there's a mandatory follow-up ground inspection to validate what we've seen from our aerial patrols. Next slide. So to talk a little bit more about our distribution system in our different areas, I spoke a little bit about our visual inspection. It's on a 3-year cycle. We are now just finishing in 2024. We finished our second drive-by cycle. It's resulted in 1,345 priority work orders, which are all fixed within 10 days of observation. So we do have priority 1s and priority 2s. Like say our priority 1s are, we dispatch crews immediately to make those repairs. We will call crews in after hours, and priority 2s, which make up the majority of these observations, need to be done within 10 days. And this represents 15% of all of our priority work, to give you a perspective of how much work these drive-by inspections are generating in our system. UNSC, their distribution system is inspected aerially on a 5-year, annually on 5 circuits, and ground patrol inspections on every year on the remainder of their circuits. The next slide. So our vegetation management program, I agree with Scott, right? That's the basis of the start of a good mitigation program for fire and avoidance. And one of the things that we have done from vegetation maintenance perspective is we have added 33% more resources on our contractors for our distribution maintenance on the vegetation side. What we're trying to do here is in this ad, and we made this ad in 2024, is we're trying to reduce the trim cycle from a current 6-year trim cycle to the 4-year trim cycle by 2028. And that's a big investment on our part. Like I say, it's increased our spend by 33%, but we do feel like it's a good response to what our current risk level is and how we can impact that risk level by investing these dollars. So also on our aerial patrols, you can see that they're showing up on our transmission system here, and on our distribution system. We have a dedicated inspector that flies on our aerial patrols that does nothing but look for vegetation. So there's 2 people in our helicopter patrols, one that's looking for maintenance issues and one that's looking for nothing but vegetation issues separately. So it really gives us good coverage as we're doing these inspections and patrols. Next slide. So I talked a little bit already about our increased investment in crews, right, in tree trim and recycles. We're also increasing our coordination with the distribution visual inspection program by adding a tag on that side for vegetation that can be created for a work order immediately for anything that's visually seen. And you can see here in this picture, there's another transmission corridor for what our corridors currently look like 10 years after they've been cleared. So you can see we're maintaining a good clean corridor down our transmission systems. And where we're off to in our UNS system, we have deployed a mobile technology to gather inspections and also assign work orders. That allows us to add additional priorities to vegetation work orders that are generated by inspectors without having to go through a transmission handoff. And the last slide. So what do we have going on for 2025? You can see on this slide, I just want to talk a little bit about our pilot projects. In 2024, we did a highly sensitive deployment of some sensors for air sampling that were detectors for early warnings, and also contacted first responders for wildfire ignitions, potential wildfire ignitions. And we found that that system was too sensitive to what it was picking up and wasn't effective without visual confirmation. So we are continuing to look for other camera technologies that will allow us to identify fires early and then notify our different responding systems to limit the size of and the spread of wildland fires in the future. We are deploying additional weather stations and cameras, and this data and information will be used by our assessing team, Cloudfire. they are not only doing the long-term planning assessment to see where we're going to invest our money to harden our system and do that, but they are also our system that's providing our day-to-day operational information on whether we should change our risk profiles and execute public safety power shutoffs in the future. So we're deploying more weather stations, more cameras, and that information for that new initiative. Our public safety power shutoff, we have community outreach that's starting this week to our stakeholders, and we'll continue our customer outreach through March, and we anticipate that we will have our full public safety power shutoff by end of April of this year. However, we do hope that we won't have to use it. So, any questions? That's the end of my presentation. So
I'll say thank you, Andrew, Scott, LV, Larry on the phone. Really appreciate everything you're doing as the state official for fire detection and suppression on about 20 million acres across the state. I really appreciate your efforts, and we do that work in coordination with our fire districts, folks like Randy down there. So really appreciate the work. You mentioned, and maybe just a comment, one of the things we're doing at the state is we're trying to, we have a request for proposals on the street right now to augment the number of AI cameras. And we actually have the AI camera feeds that you all talked about at APS into our dispatch center right now. I think that's a piece of technology that can be more expanded across the state to help with that early detection in that more effective suppression effort that Randy was talking about. So thanks. You mentioned in your remarks that you do annual inspections on portions of your transmission and distribution lines in high-risk areas. And I think I looked at the math on the slides, there's like 35,000 miles. Can you give a sense of how much of that system is in high-risk fire areas?
Sure, Tom. Thanks for the question. It's about 20%, which of course varies depending on the portion of the state. It's a fair amount of mileage to cover, which is why, we share the love and spread that out across our resources across the system and use a multitude of things like drones to speed up that process. But it's a very, very critical thing that we do, and we make sure that, again, we hit every one of those miles.
I have another question for LV, if you don't mind. All right, so LV, thank you for your presentation. And, I know that you guys have done a lot of work to minimize the risk and the fuel conditions on the state, trying to get to that pace and scale. So it makes a real difference. And I know that you mentioned you all are working to try to quantify and monetize the work that you are doing to continue to attract investments by corporate interests, and you listed some of those in your slides. I'm wondering, have you all talked about trying to monetize or quantify the effects to insurance companies or underwriters in your work?
Thank you for the question, Director. So to date, we have not quantified that risk, but we have been in conversations with NAU's Ecological Restoration Institute about at least putting together the facts about the anecdotal stories that we're hearing about loss of insurance and insurance risk that exist out there, and starting to put some of those numbers and facts together so we can start building the case on what an economic value would look like.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question related to kind of the partnerships you guys have, specifically with private individuals. I imagine that kind of the partnerships are going to be key to any large scale implementation of fuel reduction. Because, I mean, the way you talk about it, all these different entities, all these different people you have to deal with, sounds a lot like what probably a county or city would have to deal with. So with federal agencies and entities, I understand the MOUs. Could you speak a little bit to, best practices for potentially collaborating with private individuals? I can imagine just that maybe the problem tree that you guys spot is maybe someone's favorite tree or so I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Appreciate the question. And I think it starts with the same foundation, and that's relationships and reputation. And knowing, like I mentioned, that our system has been on cycle since 2016, which just means that we haven't deviated from our routine maintenance. We've had a program in place, of a forestry program, for almost 30 years. So we're no strangers to these communities. We have employees and staff and representatives that live in these communities, and representing those areas and those customers is critical to them as well. So fortunately, those relationships that we've established have helped in those conversations. And then the unfortunate part of this is some of the impact that we've seen, especially most recently in California, and some of the other states across the West, utilities specifically, that has resonated with customers. They have a better understanding of the importance of the work that we do, and being able to explain what we're trying to accomplish with subject matter experts, folks on our staff, our internal staff, that can speak to the science behind what we're doing. Really, and it may come as a surprise to you all, hasn't been that difficult. It's been, there are of course challenges, but for the most part, the message is pretty well received. And sometimes, often, it's for the wrong reasons, because they've seen what can happen if neglected.
Anyone else in the room? How about anyone online? Before we go on to discussion from the council, I just wanted to, for those of you online, I think there were some problems accessing the public comment form. That's now available. If you need to access that, you can do so now. Before we move on, is there any other discussion items for the council? Anyone online? Can't see them, so. All right, so then hearing none.
I have one.
Oh, go ahead.
Since we have a little bit of time. One of the things I heard from both APS and TEP, and I know SRP is involved in this too, is modeling. I've actually been in your operations center and seen your modeling at APS. It's pretty impressive. And one of the things that we talked about in a previous meeting is perhaps the need for a statewide model to more accurately predict risk at the landscape level. And then we heard from Frank earlier about potential modeling for the actual communities at that level. And so I don't really have a question. I'm just highlighting this issue. And I know that some states are taking a more, maybe an aggressive approach to want to adopt and require a standard model for risk used by a variety of people, including insurance companies. And so I don't really have a questions. I just wanted a question about that. I just wanted to highlight and put that sort of in our notes, that this continues to be an issue and something that we should continue to consider in the future.
Thank you. So we're getting close to time, but I am going to open it up for public comments. I am going to read the logistics. If you've not done so, please fill out the speaking slip or the Google form if you're online. Due to the agenda, again, and we're running out of time, we will limit it to 2 minutes. Online comments will be taken after in person. Online attendees will be able to unmute themselves and turn on their camera when called on. When providing comments, please first identify yourself and who you are representing, if applicable. The council will not be answering any questions during the public comment period, but may request that any matters presented be reviewed by council staff or placed on an upcoming agenda. So with that, do we have anybody in the room that has filled out a slip?
So before we go further, you all can,
Oh, sorry.
leave the table so that other people can appreciate that.
Thank you. And if you want to use the mic there at the table.
My name is Kimberly Owens, and I am a member of the Greer Coalition. Greer, Arizona is in northeastern Arizona, and we experienced the Wallow Fire, and we've had property in the area, my family, for 60 years. And we heard about what the state of Arizona is doing, and we applaud you. We're watching, and we want to help wherever we can. Thank you.
Anyone else in the room? Is there any online? And Carrie, I'll have you go ahead and call on anybody online since I can't see them. All right, I'm hearing. If you wanted to make a comment online, can you raise your hand so we're aware? Okay, so I'm going to, as before we close, just give some next meeting logistics. The council normally meets monthly on the second Wednesday of each month at 1 o'clock unless otherwise noted in the agenda. Also, please note that there might be room changes as we had today, so make sure you go on and check the website. The following meetings will not be held on the second Wednesday. The one in April is Tuesday, April 8th, Thursday, May 15th, and Tuesday, July 8th are variances from the second Wednesday. So the next council meeting is scheduled for March 12th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We will continue the discussions around wildfire resiliency and mitigation research at that meeting. Again, I want to thank all the speakers, those who came in from out of state and in state that joined us today. And we look forward to hearing from you all next month. Director, any closing comments?
No, I just wanted to make sure to thank everybody and thank you all for coming in person and interacting with the speakers. It's been really helpful.
Thank you. Meeting's adjourned.